This is not fiction. Every story in this video is real. But none of them have been fully explained. Disappearing planes, empty cockpits, flights with no answers. Let's start with one of the most mysterious cases in aviation history. On March 8, 2014, a routine overnight passenger flight departed from Kuala Lumpur, bound for Beijing. Flight MH370, a Boeing 777 aircraft. On board were 239 people. Nothing suggested anything unusual. Passengers took their seats. The crew prepared for departure. It was a standard international flight. The aircraft taxied to the runway at Kuala Lumpur International Airport. It took off during calm night conditions. Within minutes, it disappeared into the darkness of the sky. A routine flight began its journey and vanished from history. Roughly 1 hour into the flight, the aircraft entered the airspace of a neighboring country. And that is when the first anomalies began. Communication with the flight was suddenly lost. The last known transmission from the cockpit was calm and routine. Good night, Malaysian 370. After that, silence. No distress signal. No emergency message. No attempt to re-establish contact. The aircraft disappeared from both civilian and military radar systems. Later, it was revealed that the flight path had deviated from its planned route. Instead of continuing northeast toward Beijing, the aircraft turned back and headed toward the Indian Ocean. Why this happened remains one of aviation's greatest mysteries. A massive search operation was launched. It became the largest search effort in aviation history. Dozens of countries took part. Hundreds of aircraft and ships scanned the ocean. Satellites analyzed millions of square kilometers of data. But the ocean gave no answers. No signal. No confirmed coordinates. No verified crash site. Only emptiness. Over time, several theories emerged. Mechanical failure, but no distress signal was ever sent. Hijacking, but no group ever claimed responsibility. Pilot intervention, but the motive remains unknown. Loss of communication or navigation failure was also considered. Yet none of these theories fully explain what happened. Months later, the first physical evidence began to appear. On islands in the Indian Ocean and along the East African coast, debris was discovered. Wing fragments, pieces of the aircraft's structure, components later confirmed by investigators to be linked to flight MH370. This provided the first real confirmation that the aircraft had indeed ended its journey in the ocean. But even this did not answer the most important question. Where exactly it crashed and what happened in the final hours of the flight still remains unknown. 239 people, one aircraft, and no definitive answers. The story of MH370 remains one of the greatest and most haunting aviation mysteries of the modern era. And the question still remains, what happened that night in the sky? The ghost plane, *2005, Helios Airways Flight 522. A routine passenger flight from Larnaca to Athens. Nothing suggested anything was wrong. But shortly after takeoff, contact with the crew is suddenly lost. Air traffic controllers try to reach the aircraft. There is no response. And the strangest part, the plane keeps flying. It doesn't descend. It doesn't change course. It simply continues forward. The autopilot maintains its programmed route, as if everything is normal. But something is terribly wrong on board. Fighter jets are scrambled to intercept the aircraft. As they approach, a chilling scene unfolds. The cockpit is silent. No movement. No response. The pilots are unconscious. The passengers as well. The entire aircraft is in complete silence. The cause soon becomes clear. Cabin depressurization and loss of oxygen. At cruising altitude, this means only one thing: a gradual loss of consciousness for everyone on board. The aircraft becomes what is known as a ghost flight. It continues flying on its own, without control, until, eventually, the fuel runs out and only then does the silent flight come to an end. The aircraft falls. No one on board ever realized what was happening. 121 people. One airplane. And silence, lasting until the very end. This tragedy became a reminder of how fragile life can be at 30,000 feet, and how sometimes a plane can keep flying even when there is no one left awake inside. Northwest Airlines Flight 85, a long-haul international flight from Detroit to Tokyo, a Boeing 747. Over 400 people on board. Hours into the flight, high above the Pacific Ocean, everything seems normal. Until suddenly, the aircraft begins to drift. At first, it's subtle. A slight uncommanded turn. The pilots correct it, but it happens again and again, and it becomes clear this is not turbulence. Something is wrong with the aircraft itself. The rudder, a critical control surface on the tail, has malfunctioned. It is no longer responding properly. Worse, it is stuck. The aircraft begins to yaw, pulling to one side. The pilots fight to maintain control, using every available system, but the aircraft resists. Every correction feels delayed. Unstable. Unpredictable. Inside the cockpit, the situation is escalating. This is not a minor issue. At cruising altitude, over open ocean, a loss of directional control can become catastrophic. The crew quickly evaluates their options. Continuing to Tokyo is too dangerous. They decide to divert their destination, Japan, but getting there is only part of the challenge. Landing the aircraft will be the real test. As the plane descends, the problem remains. The rudder is still jammed. The aircraft still pulls. The pilots must anticipate every movement in advance. They are not just flying the plane, they are fighting it. On the ground, emergency services prepare. Runways are cleared. Teams are on standby. Everyone knows this could go very wrong. Final approach. The aircraft lines up with the runway, slightly unstable. Constant corrections. The margin for error is almost zero. And then something changes. The aircraft begins to stabilize. The violent resistance seems to ease. Control becomes smoother, more predictable. The pilots guide the aircraft down. Carefully. Slowly. And then touchdown. The plane lands safely. No injuries, no fatalities. Over 400 lives saved. But the real mystery begins after the landing. Investigators examine the aircraft. They discover a failure in the rudder control system. Mechanical issue deep within the tail. Under certain conditions, it caused the rudder to deflect without pilot input. A dangerous, rare malfunction. But even with this explanation, some questions remain. Why did the aircraft become easier to control in the final moments? Why did the resistance suddenly decrease? The data explains the failure, but not the timing. Not the feeling described by the pilots. They reported that, at one point, the aircraft seemed to stop fighting them. As if something changed. As if, for just a moment, everything aligned. In aviation, not everything is chaos or control. Sometimes, there is a thin line between both. And sometimes, survival depends on what happens in that invisible space. The pilot who sent the plane into nowhere. The story of Egyptair Flight 990. Crash * 1999 year Egyptair Flight 990. A scheduled international flight from New York to Cairo. A Boeing 767 aircraft. On board minus 217 people. It is a night flight. The cabin lights are dimmed. Passengers are resting. The aircraft cruises high above the Atlantic Ocean. Everything appears routine. The flight reaches cruising altitude. Systems are stable. The journey is progressing normally. Inside the cockpit, the environment is calm. Then, at one point, the captain leaves his seat. He exits the cockpit, leaving the first officer alone. For a few moments, everything remains unchanged. And then the aircraft begins to descend. At first, it is gradual, almost unnoticeable, but within seconds, the descent becomes more aggressive. No warning is transmitted. No distress signal is sent. Air traffic control sees the altitude dropping. They attempt to make contact. There is no response. Inside the cockpit. Something is happening. From the cockpit voice recorder, investigators later reconstruct the final moments. The first officer is heard, speaking, repeating a phrase, again and again. Calmly, quietly, almost detached from reality. He does not call for help. He does not communicate with control. He does not explain his actions. The aircraft continues, descending rapidly. Then, the captain returns to the cockpit. He immediately understands that something is very wrong. He tries to pull the aircraft up to regain control. For a brief moment, the descent slows. The aircraft begins to recover, but then it pitches down again, even more aggressively. The struggle continues. Two pilots, opposing inputs, one trying to save the aircraft, the other not responding in a way that makes sense. The systems record conflicting commands. The aircraft moves violently through the night sky. Altitude dropping, speed increasing. There is very little time left, and then the aircraft breaks apart and crashes into the Atlantic Ocean. All 217 people on board are lost. The investigation that follows becomes one of the most controversial in aviation history. In the United States, investigators analyze flight data and cockpit recordings. Their conclusion: the first officer intentionally caused the crash, but Egyptian authorities reject this. They argue that the aircraft suffered a mechanical failure, a problem within the control systems. They question the interpretation of the cockpit recordings. They challenge the conclusions. Two investigations, two completely different answers. And no definitive resolution. Even today, experts continue to debate what really happened. Was it a deliberate act? Was it a hidden technical failure? Or something that has never been fully understood? Because sometimes, in aviation, the data tells a story, but not the whole story, and the truth remains somewhere in between. The plane that disappeared and came back, British Airways Flight 009, long-haul international flight from Kuala Lumpur to London. Boeing 747, more than 240 people on board. Night flight over Indonesia. Altitude over 35,000 feet. The cabin is dim. Most passengers are asleep. Inside the cockpit, calm. All instruments show normal readings. The route is stable. Nothing seems unusual. And then something strange begins. Passengers start noticing an unusual glow outside the windows. Faint streaks of light sliding across the aircraft, almost like static electricity, but different. The pilots notice it too. They don't understand what they are seeing, and within moments, the situation escalates. Engine begins to surge. Then it fails. Seconds later, another then a third and finally the fourth. 4 engines shut down. Completely. The aircraft is left without thrust. At high altitude. In total. Darkness. Over the ocean. Inside the cockpit. There is a brief moment of silence. This is a situation no one is ever truly prepared for. The captain makes an announcement. Calm. Control. As if nothing critical is happening. But the words will be remembered forever. We have a small problem. All 4 engines have stopped. The aircraft begins to descend. No thrust. No engine noise. Only the sound of wind and the feeling of falling. The crew begins restart. Procedures. They follow every step, again and again, but nothing happens. The engines do not respond. Meanwhile, the aircraft continues descending. Altitude drops rapidly. And then it becomes clear they have entered a cloud. But not a normal cloud. Volcanic ash cloud. Microscopic particles in massive concentration. They enter the engines and shut them down. The problem is these clouds are invisible to radar. The crew had no warning. The aircraft keeps descending. Thousands of feet lost. Time is running out. If the engines do not restart, the outcome is inevitable. And then at a critical altitude, something unexpected happens. One engine comes back to life. Then another. And a third. And finally, the fourth. Aircraft regains power. Control is restored, but the danger is not over. The cockpit windshield has been severely Damage. The ash has acted like sandpaper. Visibility is nearly gone. The pilots can barely see. Outside, they must land the aircraft almost blind, relying on instruments and instinct. The aircraft descends, lines up for approach. Slowly. Carefully. And then touchdown. Successful landing. No fatalities. More than 240 lives saved. But the investigation is just beginning. Experts analyze the data and reach a conclusion. The cause was a volcanic ash cloud from a nearby eruption, a rare and poorly understood hazard at the time. The aircraft had flown directly into an invisible threat. After this incident, aviation rules were changed. Global monitoring systems for volcanic ash were introduced. New safety procedures were established. To prevent this from ever happening again. Because sometimes danger is invisible. It does not appear on instruments. It gives no warning and arrives without being seen. And in those moments, everything depends on one thing: whether the crew can understand what they are facing before it's too late. The plane that lost control. The story of Alaska Airlines Flight 261 crashed January 31st, 2000. Alaska Airlines Flight 261 Amperes. Scheduled passenger flight from Puerto Vallarta to San Francisco. With a planned stop in Seattle. On board, 88 people. The flight begins normally. Clear weather. Stable climb. The aircraft reaches cruising altitude. Over the Pacific Ocean. Everything appears routine. Until a small problem appears. Pilots notice resistance in the control system. The horizontal stabilizer does not respond smoothly. At first, it seems minor. They try to correct it, and it works, but only temporarily. Minutes later, the issue returns. Stronger. The aircraft begins to behave unpredictably. Nose dips slightly. The pilots correct it again, but each correction requires more effort. Something is wrong. Deep inside the aircraft, a critical mechanism is wearing down. A small component, almost invisible, is failing. The pilots contact air traffic control. They report a stabilizer issue. And request lower altitude. The situation is becoming serious. The aircraft continues along the California coast, but control is getting harder. Every input feels delayed. Unstable. The aircraft no longer responds as expected. And then for a brief moment, they regain control. The aircraft stabilizes. Everything seems manageable. Again, hope returns, but it doesn't last. Suddenly, the system fails completely. Without warning. The stabilizer moves to an extreme position. The nose drops sharply. The aircraft rolls, then dives. Steeply. Violently. The pilots fight to recover, using every control they have, but nothing responds. The aircraft is no longer controllable. It descends rapidly over the Pacific Ocean, off the coast of California. Within seconds, it's over. The aircraft crashes into the ocean. All 88 people on board are lost. The investigation reveals the cause: a worn jackscrew mechanism in the stabilizer system. A small component, but critical. Over time, lack of lubrication led to its failure. And once it failed, the pilots had no control left. But what makes this case so unsettling is that the failure was not sudden. It developed. Gradually. The pilots noticed it. They tried to manage it. They almost succeeded. But in aviation, there are moments when control is lost forever. And after that, nothing can be done.